Well, good morning once again, brethren. I suspect that at least several of you saw the cover of the Newsweek article of the Newsweek magazine back a couple of weeks ago, actually. Very recent cover. Mr. Meredith commented on it in the recent coworker letter. And I want to introduce the sermon today with some comments about this because I think it is important that we understand a little bit of how some of this fits into the overall scheme of things and the direction that things are headed in the world around us, the events that are transpiring. It's very interesting, some of the connections. The article, of course, again, major feature, the cover article, Hail Mary. You know, you think about it, this is quite a remarkable subject for a news magazine, a secular news magazine, to be focusing attention on. Now, their focus is that there's a growing movement in the Roman Catholic Church which wants the Pope to proclaim a new controversial dogma, that Mary is co-redeemer. Co-redeemer with Jesus Christ. And so it says, this week a large box shipped from California and addressed to His Holiness John Paul II will arrive at the Vatican. The shipping label lists a dozen countries from every continent but Antarctica, plus a number for 40,383, indicating the quantity of signatures inside. Each signature is attached to a petition asking the Pope to exercise the power of papal infallibility to proclaim a new dogma of the Roman Catholic Church, and that is that the Virgin Mary is co-redemptrix, mediatrix of all graces, and advocate for the people of God. Now that's quite a thing. She's the co-redeemer and the co-mediator, and is the one ultimately through whom all prayers must be addressed. Now, one of the interesting things that the article brings out is that there has been, well, as the article goes on to state, in many ways the 20th century has belonged to Mary. Now, maybe you never knew that. I don't know that I'd ever thought of the 20th century as belonging to Mary, but that's what Newsweek says. From almost every continent, visionaries have reported more than 400 apparitions of the Virgin, more than in the previous 3 centuries combined. Oh, so there's been this great upsurge in sightings of apparitions of Mary. Now, it goes on, it says, taken together, these visions point to what the Marian movement within the church believes is a millennial age of Mary. You didn't realize the millennium was the age of Mary. I didn't know that. I don't know that I realized that either, but that's what it says. You know, Newsweek's a reliable source, right? Well, it goes on to say that to traditional points of pilgrimage, such as Lourdes and Fatima, the movement has added Majorca, which is a backwater Croatian-speaking enclave of about 250 families in Bosnia. It has become the new Fatima, visited by an estimated 10 to 20 million pilgrims. People coming here making pilgrimages, looking for miracles, looking for healing, looking for miraculous intervention in their life. Now, one other very interesting point that is made here, says many Catholics who were once in the Charismatic Movement have migrated to Mary. Do you realize that in recent decades, the most outstanding phenomenon that has swept the professing Christian world has been the phenomena of what is called Charismatic Renewal? Back at the beginning of this century and for many decades on up, really through the 60s, this sort of thing was limited to the Pentecostal churches and various offshoots, Assemblies of God, various groups that trace themselves back to the Pentecostal movement launched around 1900, actually at a tent revival in Los Angeles, if you want to get specific about it. I think right around 1900 or 1901, something like that. This movement, which was really on the edge, on the periphery, for decades, has in the last perhaps 2 to 3 decades begun to migrate into the mainstream professing Christian churches, so that among Methodists and among Episcopals and among Presbyterians and various groups that have never traditionally had any connection with this so-called charismatic renewal, that there have been charismatics and charismatic movements in those churches, and there has been a growing acceptance of this Charismatic Renewal. And that not only was limited to the Protestants, but it began to migrate into the Catholic Church to where millions of Catholics became caught up in charismatic manifestations, primarily speaking in tongues and things of this sort. Now, the interesting thing is that the Catholics who have been involved in this movement are now the ones who are in the forefront of the Mary movement. Now, you know what it all has in common, of course, is that it is tied in to manifestations. It's tied into signs and wonders. You see, people are looking for a feeling. They're looking for something they can feel. And that's one aspect that has increasingly swept the Catholic Church, have been apparitions of Mary. You know, back at the early part of this century, in the time prior to and right around World War I, there was a series of, in fact, the Newsweek article has the dates on some of these things, but this was back in 1917 in Fatima, Portugal. 3 young children, ages 7 to 14, saw Mary 6 times between the spring and the fall of 1917. And she referred to herself as the Immaculate Heart. In 1942, Pope Pius XII entrusted the whole world to the Immaculate Heart. Maybe you didn't know that, but it's all in her hands now. That's what the Pope said, and he was infallible proclamation. Well, the remarkable thing about this Visions of Fatima, which there were revelations supposedly made that have been given great credence all the way up to the very highest echelons of the Catholic Church. Revelations provided by Mary, as it is supposed. Now, as these things have built, and all of these apparitions, and the Newsweek article goes through and it details about all of the crying statues and the bleeding statues and bleeding communion hosts and all sorts of things that are being looked upon as great signs and wonders. They quote from a magazine, which is a Catholic publication entitled Signs of the Times. It is the leading journal of the Apparitions movement. This is the movement within the Catholic Church that is placing great emphasis on all these apparitions and appearances of Mary. In this particular magazine, the editors have pieced together a millennialist scenario from all the messages of Mary dating back a century. They foresee a supernatural warning, the world's greatest miracle, followed by 3 days of darkness they call the Great Chastisement. Now, that's interesting because, you know, in Matthew chapter 24, let's just notice a couple of things. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus Christ said, in verse 24, now he's speaking in Matthew 24 in response to a question from his disciples, tell us, what shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of this age? So they were focused in on the fact that the Messiah would make an appearance in power and glory. That the age in which we live, the age dominated by man's rule, was going to come to an end, and they understood that. The disciples were under no illusion that they were in the kingdom now. They recognized that, you know. In fact, the last question they asked Christ before he ascended to heaven, it's recorded in Acts 1, they said, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? They knew that the kingdom had not yet been established or restored, and they had asked him about what would be the signs, how would you know? And Jesus said in verse 24 of Matthew 24, there shall arise false Christs, false messiahs, and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Jesus Christ spoke of a time between now and the end of this age when great, impressive signs and wonders would be made manifest. Great signs and wonders would be shown. Now let's just notice on back in Revelation 13. I'm not going to go into all the background setting of Revelation 13. We have a booklet on the subject, and you can, if you want to go into the background, because the point that I just want to call your attention to something is we're sitting here talking about the beast in Revelation 13 and the accompanying false religious system that is in alliance with it. And what you find in Revelation 13 is a description of events beginning with the fall of the old Roman Empire and its revival as the Holy Roman Empire, and the relationship through the medieval period of the church and the empire, and that, of course, serving as a type of what will occur in the end time, the very end time. Now, notice here, as it describes in Revelation 13:11, it describes another beast, another creature. It comes up out of the earth. It has an earthly origin, not a heavenly origin. It appears Christian. It looks like a lamb. So it claims and presents itself as though it represents Jesus Christ, and yet it speaks like the dragon. Now, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So what comes out is not the lamb's message, it's the dragon's message. But if you look at it in terms of outward appearance, the way it presents itself, it's like a lamb. Now, it's pictured as having two horns. Horns are used in the Bible as symbolic of authority, and this particular institution is both a civil state and a religious institution. There is both religious and civil authority that it exercises. But notice what it does. It is in alliance with the old Roman Empire. It exercises the power of the Roman Empire, and it insists that its adherents give their loyalty and allegiance, their devotion, to the revived, restored Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. But notice verse 13, it does great wonders, so that it makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceives those that dwell on the earth by the means of the miracles, which he had power to do in the sight of the beast. So, we're looking at great miraculous displays. We're looking at great signs and wonders, lying wonders. We're looking at things that are so impressive, that are going to appear so real, that are going to appear so dramatic, that if it were possible, even the very elect would be deceived. In other words, you're not going to be able to look at these things and see the obvious fraud connected with it, because the fraud part won't be obvious. The devil can manifest things in dramatic ways. Look at what man can do. Look at all the technology that man has. I remember back, number of months ago now, right after my son was married up in Missouri, and some of my wife's family had come down from Canada, one of her brothers and one of her sisters, and so the day after the wedding, we all went a few miles down to Branson and spent part of a day there together, and then they left to go back where they needed to go, and we came on back south. But while we were there, one of the places we went was to the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but one of the things that really intrigued me when I came in, as you started in, they had a replica, it was behind glass, they had a replica of Ripley's office. Now you look at that, and that's just, desk and bookshelves and everything, it looks just an office, and you look at it, and about the time you're wonder what do they have that set up for, all of a sudden, this hologram of Ripley appears behind the desk, and there he is sitting there. It looks just, it's just there. And this, of course, is laser technology, but it's still impressive. All of a sudden, he's sitting there, and he's talking to you. And then he disappears, and you're just looking in there. It's not just like a film projection or something, and you stand there and it rotates through, a certain amount of time, another minute goes by, and, all of a sudden here he is, just sort of materializes, and he's there, and it's a remarkable thing. Looks like something you see on the old Star Wars movie or something. Here this 3D picture just appears, and he begins to talk and to tell you about what you're going to see, and then he just disappears. Now, you look at something like that, and you say, man has the technology and the capability with laser technology and various things to create holograms and to create the appearance of 3D objects. It's really remarkable. Do you think people are smarter than the devil is? Do you think Satan can figure out how to do a few things? If man can figure out how to do things with his technology, you think, Satan can't figure out how to do things like that? You think it's any great thing that, some great apparition appear? Perhaps speaking great things and great dramatic, it says signs and wonders that are so impressive that if all you were looking for were signs and wonders, you'd believe it because it's going to look real. And there are remarkable things that have happened, and they don't hold a candle to what's going to happen. It's going to sweep the whole world up into an emotional fervor, a religious awakening that is going to sweep so many people up in it that those who refuse to be swept up in it are going to be viewed as enemies. You see, we live in a world that's being ripped apart by all sorts of ethnic and religious rivalries, don't we? We live in a world that is increasingly unified in terms of the global economy. Very interesting. The new coins in Europe have made their appearance. This was ahead of schedule. They show a woman on one side. They show a woman riding on a bull. Sort of interesting, with her hand held aloft. It's interesting, some of the symbolism that is there. One person who was recently in Europe, in fact, had toured there in Italy, was telling me one of the things that fascinated her as she was there, and she saw many of the pictures of Mary there in the Vatican, was that on so many of those, she had a blue covering over her head, and there were 12 stars on that. Now, that is the flag of the European community. And that, they were it really struck them because these were old pictures. I mean, these were pictures that dated back to the medieval times. It's obvious where the symbolism is coming from. They're looking for what is going to bring them together and unite them. And as some of this emotional fervor begins to sweep, then those who refuse to be caught up in it for whatever means are going to be viewed as enemies, as troublemakers, as those who would bring division into a world that needs unity. You see, one thing about the charismatic movement is it does not consist of people who are searching the Scriptures trying to understand correct doctrine. It consists of people, many of whom may be very sincere. I'm not questioning their sincerity. But it consists of people who are looking for a feeling. They are looking for some sort of outward manifestation, some sort of a feeling. And you can be worked up and caught up in emotional things. In some cases, it can be a matter of pure emotion and just the crowd psychology. And in other cases, people can be caught up in those excesses and actually invite in a spirit influence that they don't fully understand. Now, it's interesting what God says. Why won't the very elect be caught up in that? Well, we're told in Isaiah 8, verse 19. And when they shall say unto you, seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep and that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God for the living to the dead? To seek to the dead? Mary is dead. Her remains have long since turned to dust in the grave where she was buried. She is dead, awaiting the resurrection, just as everyone else who has died is awaiting the resurrection. For people to seek to the dead? That's crazy. Should not a people seek unto their God? Verse 20, to the law and to the testimony. If they speak not according to this word, it's because there's no light in them. You see, the criteria is not simply how does it feel. The criteria is not some great impressive apparition that appears in the clouds. It's not some statue that begins to weep or to bleed. That's not what you look for as the proof of what God is doing and where God is working. To the law and to the testimony. If they speak not according to this word, there's no truth in them. You see, God gives us the Bible as a means of evaluating truth, as a means of putting things together and understanding whether or not something is valid or not. Now, In the course of my recent sermons here, we have focused in on the subject of faith, hope, and love, as the Scripture lays it out, and there was a reason for that, because in 1 Corinthians chapters 12, 13, and 14, in chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul introduces the subject of spiritual gifts. Now, the world is all caught up in and excited about various spiritual manifestations, various gifts of the Spirit. And this is a focus of the Charismatic Renewal, which is actually leading right in and setting the stage for some of this final emphasis and increasing obsession with manifestations and so-called miraculous appearances. Now, Paul introduces the subject of spiritual gifts. The Bible talks about spiritual gifts. And he goes through and begins to explain about it in chapter 12. And then at the end of chapter 12, verse 31, he says, "Covet earnestly," or desire earnestly, "the best gifts. And yet I show unto you a more excellent way." Then he begins to go through and talk about, in chapter 13, the subject of love. He says, regardless of what I manifest, regardless of what language I speak in, I can speak in the tongues of men and of angels. If I don't have love, it's nothing. If I have the gift of prophecy, I have all knowledge, I have all faith, any of these areas, I excel to the ultimate. If my motivation isn't love, it counts for nothing. And he ends up in verse 13 of 1 Corinthians 13, "Now abides faith, hope, and love, these three, but the greatest of these is love." And then he says, "Go on from love," in chapter 14, verse 1, "and desire spiritual gifts." You see, faith, hope, and love set the stage for God's working in us and through us. The subject of spiritual gifts is one that is greatly misunderstood. It's totally misunderstood by the world around us, by the professing Christian world. They don't understand what spiritual gifts are. Not really. They talk about it. They use some of the terms that come out of the Bible. But just as we're going to see, as did many in Corinth, they misunderstood what was involved in spiritual gifts. Now, the world is increasingly going to be caught up in an illusion. The world is increasingly going to be caught up in a counterfeit, in something that purports to be that which it is not. Brethren, we need to understand the real thing. And we need to understand the importance of the real thing. Spiritual gifts are important, but I think in some cases we might be surprised to find out what all is included in spiritual gifts. Now, Paul first lays an emphasis on faith, hope, and love. He says, before you telling the people in Corinth that they needed to get their priorities straight. Now let's go back to 1 Corinthians 12, verse 1. Let's understand. He said, "Now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I would not have you ignorant. You know that you were Gentiles, carried away unto these dumb idols, even as you were led. Wherefore, I give you to understand, no man speaking by the Spirit of God calls Jesus accursed." Now let's just stop there and look a little bit. The Corinthians were ignorant about spiritual gifts, and Paul did not want them to remain so. One of the main reasons they were ignorant about spiritual gifts was because of their background. All of us are the product of our background. We've been influenced in our concepts of what seems normal to us. All of those things are influenced by the background in which we grew up. Just up the road, just a few miles from Corinth, was the most famous oracle of the ancient world, of the Greek world. And that was the Oracle at Delphi. Delphi was located very near Corinth, just a few miles away. And for a number of centuries, Delphi had been the center for the worship of Apollo. Apollo was the god of wisdom and revelation, as well as being the sun god. You see, the sun is symbolic of bringing light. And so, for centuries, people would travel to Delphi from all over the Mediterranean world. They would travel to Delphi to consult the Oracle of Delphi. Now, the Oracle of Delphi was always a woman, a priestess of Apollo. And there were various priestesses of Apollo and priests of Apollo, but the oracle was always a woman. And when people would come to consult the oracle, the question would be put. There was a ceremony that took place. It involved beating drums and shaking tambourines and beginning to dance around the altar of Apollo. And the chants that the priestesses would take up as the priests would play this music, and they would work themselves up into a frenzy. Sometimes it would go on for hours as they would work themselves up into a frenzy, and at some point, the oracle would begin to speak with the tongues of the gods. Writers described as ecstasy. Sometimes she would fall over backward. Sometimes she would begin to foam at the mouth. She would break out into this wild speech that was, really, it was gibberish is what it was. But they viewed that Apollo the god was speaking through her in the language of the gods. And one of the priests would interpret. You see, she was speaking in tongues, and he had the gift of interpretation of tongues. And so he would, claim to interpret for those who were standing there. And, they were often ambiguous in terms of the oracle, in terms of what was being said. They're sort of like the king who sent an emissary. He was preparing to go to war with the Persians. And he sent an emissary to the Oracle of Apollo asking him if he should go out to battle and how it would go. And they went through all of this, and the oracle's message was, go forth to battle and a great empire will be destroyed. He did, and it was his own. You can, sort of like a Chinese fortune cookie, you can come out with these things and, that sounds impressive, sort of sounds like what you want to hear. You can read into it. So the oracles were not, they had a little bit of strategy. But this oracle at Delphi had functioned for centuries, and it continued to function through this period for another couple of centuries. Now the Corinthians had heard, they'd grown up surrounded by that. You see, you know what the name that the Greeks used for that? The Greek word for tongues, glossalia. That's what they called what the oracle at Delphi did. You see, that term was a word that could mean several things. It could refer to your tongue, the physical part of your body. It could also just mean languages, when as it clearly does, when you read in Acts chapter 2, the gift that God gave was a gift of miraculous speaking in another language, which the speaker had not learned. And it's very apparent when you read Acts 2, Peter and the others were not speaking in some sort of gibberish. There were people who were standing there, and it describes Medes and Elamites and dwellers in Mesopotamia, and strangers from Rome and Cappadocia and Arabia, people from all over, Jews from all over. Now, Jews in Rome spoke Latin, just like Jews here in Dallas speak English. And Jews down in, over in Russia spoke Russian, and Jews in Germany spoke German. So that was nothing strange. You had people who had come there to observe the day of Pentecost from all over the known world. And they all spoke the language of their community. Now, most of them knew a smattering of Hebrew. They knew, enough to participate in the service in the synagogue and this sort of thing. Very few of them were fluent in it. In fact, most of the Jews in Palestine really weren't fluent in Hebrew. They spoke Aramaic, which was a similar dialect. But even in Palestine, when the scriptures were read in Hebrew, they were paraphrased into Aramaic because most people didn't understand it clearly. Sort of like Catholics from years ago when Latin was used in all the Catholic services. Most people who grew up Catholic back in those days, they understood a smattering of Latin, but they couldn't have really carried on a conversation in it and have really thoroughly understood something in depth. They just knew words and phrases and certain things. That's the way most Jews were at that time with the Hebrew language. They primarily spoke the language of their area and maybe Greek or Aramaic, which were languages that were sort of widely used in trade and commerce. God gave to the apostles the miraculous gift. They had grown up in the immediate area there of Palestine. They didn't grow up speaking Latin. They didn't grow up speaking Arabian. They didn't grow up speaking the language of Mesopotamia. And all of a sudden, they began to give sermons and to explain the truth of God in languages that these people understood. Now, somebody standing there that didn't understand the language, the first Jews who were around there and heard the apostles thought, well, these guys been drinking, they're getting up there, I can't understand a word he's saying. And somebody standing next to him said, well, I can, he's speaking Latin, I'm from Rome. I understand everything he's saying. I didn't know he knew Latin. And the other fellow standing over a little further, he was listening to the others. You have to realize the apostles, when it describes this, they were there in an area, and the crowds began to gather around. It didn't take long to sort out that the ones who spoke one language were standing over there where that language was being spoken. They didn't have a loudspeaker system where they set it up and it just broadcast to the whole temple precinct. They obviously taught in smaller groups. Crowds were standing around, but if you cut the microphone off and you're facing in a particular way, a number of people can crowd around and they can hear you. Somebody else who's standing back a few feet and facing the other direction, he's saying things, and the crowd back there is hearing him, not you. So, anyway, this was the gift that God had given, called in the Scriptures the gift of tongues or the gift of languages. And you read Acts chapter 2 carefully, and it's very clear that it was a miraculous speaking in languages, in foreign languages foreign to the speaker. Another thing that was very obviously the case in Acts chapter 2 was the apostles had not spent time sort of working themselves up into some emotional fever pitch to where one of them sort of fell over backward and began to, say things. That's not what you read. We're told suddenly the room was filled with something like a mighty rushing wind. It was something that appeared suddenly. It originated with God. It did not originate with people. It didn't originate with working up human emotion. It wasn't something that took a tarry meeting, as they termed it in the Pentecostal church, where they would there and they would sing and they would chant and they would sort of work things up, and the preacher would work the crowd and begin to get them responding and just sort of work things up into this emotional fever pitch. And sure enough, somebody would start in or would fall out and this sort of thing. That's not what you read there in Acts chapter 2. That's not what happened at all. Now the Corinthians, Paul said, I don't want you to be ignorant concerning spiritual gifts. You were Gentiles carried about with all these dumb idols. You grew up with all that stuff. You grew up in the midst of all these pagan things. And I don't want you to remain ignorant about spiritual gifts, because you're taking things that you were familiar with in your old pagan idolatrous background, and you're trying to bring it in, and you're misunderstanding the gifts of God in light of the idolatrous background that you had. He said, I can tell you one thing right off. One easy way to figure out whether or not someone is being inspired by the Spirit of God. No man speaking by the Spirit of God calls Jesus accursed. Now, why would Paul bring that up? Well, evidently, when some of them went into these fits and were saying things, they were saying all kinds of things. And Paul said, well, look, you don't have to think very hard to figure out the Holy Spirit's not going to inspire you to say something like that. Then he went on and he said, there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. Now, what you find as we go through here and we look a little bit at these gifts is the things that attracted the Corinthians. The things that attracted the Corinthians were the things that were showy and flashy. The things that would impress other people and sort of call attention to themselves and how spiritual they were. Now, you know how spiritual the Corinthians were, because if you've read the first part of the book, Paul already made plain that they weren't spiritual, they were carnal. In fact, he told them at the beginning of the book, he said, I can't speak to you as unto spiritual, but as unto carnal. 1 Corinthians is one of the most corrective letters Paul wrote. And he went through there, and you remember the whole situation. And he told them that they were puffed up spiritually, back in 1 Corinthians 5. There were some of them that were so mad at each other they were going to court. Remember 1 Corinthians 6? Somebody was suing someone else right there in the Corinthian church. I mean, you go through and you realize that this was not the church of spiritual giants. It was when you put the story together in the book of Acts, what you find is Corinth was a major city, major seaport, and it was spread out, and evidently there were actually several groups, more like maybe what we would term Bible study groups, that were meeting in different homes in different areas, some down in the port area of Cenchrea, which is evidently where Phoebe was, who was a deaconess, and perhaps it was her home. She seems to have been a wealthy person who perhaps had a large home, and there were those who were meeting down there, and there were others who were meeting in 2 or 3 places, and I'm sure they all got together. In fact, the indication is therefore the holy day, because Paul's references in 1 Corinthians 5 to unleavened bread and Passover, which I really don't want to get into in terms of the context, but I'm just trying to set a little bit of background that there was a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of things that they didn't clearly understand. There was no one there at this point. There does not seem to have been a pastor, full-time pastor there in Corinth, as in some of the other epistles, Paul names the pastor and gives specific instruction to him. That did not seem to be the case in Corinth. It seemed to have been a little more loosely organized in terms of various groups. Paul came through and he faced the difficulty sometimes of simply not having manpower to leave in certain areas. He had Timothy traveling with him, and Titus, young men that he trained, and he left Titus behind in Crete to set in order and organize things, and he would send Timothy and send various ones, but he had a real problem with a manpower shortage of those that he had trained, and in some of these areas he would leave things, would do it the best that he could, and yet there were complications, and so he wrote back letters to try to straighten things out. Now, Paul brings out in 1 Corinthians 12:4 that there are differences of gifts. It's the same Spirit, diversities. There are differences of administrations, but the same Lord. Now, I want to read a little bit of this in a couple of other translations just to help us maybe make it a little plainer. He said here, this is from the New English Bible. He said, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of service, but the same Lord. There are many forms of work, but all of them and all men are the work of the same God, or in all men through whom God is working, those who have God's Spirit. Or as the Amplified Bible brings it out, there are distinctive varieties of service and ministration, but it is the same Lord. So there are distinctive varieties of operation, of working to accomplish things, but it's the same God who inspires and energizes them all in all. This is the point that God works through people, and everyone does not have the same gifts. Now we're going to see what some of those gifts are. You see, the manifestation of the Spirit, chapter 12, verse 7, is given to every man to profit withal. God manifests His Spirit through us, and we're going to see from some other scriptures that we all have gifts. It's important to understand what all of this involves and how we can be profitable servants of God with the gifts we have. You see, verse 8 says, Paul begins to illustrate. Whatever way the Spirit manifests itself is given there to profit. To one is given by the Spirit the word of wisdom. To another, the word of knowledge by the same Spirit. Now, what's the difference between the word of wisdom and the word of knowledge? Well, some people have a particular gift, and it is a gift. God's Spirit is the agency by which that gift is amplified. Some people have a gift of being able to take and apply principles of the Scripture. Wisdom involves application of things in life. Some people have a particular gift to be able to take and apply principles and to give wise counsel and wise advice, to be able to derive from God's Word principles and really to have insight and understanding in how those principles apply in circumstances with people and maybe in family situations. And they really have an ability, have a gift for wisdom. Everybody doesn't have that gift the same way. To another, the word of knowledge. There are others whose expertise may be more in the matter of technical explanation. They can go through and they have insight into being able to explain and expound and give a technical explanation to help understand exactly what something says and what it means. They have an ability of knowledge and understanding that's a little different than someone else who may have more of a gift of wisdom. All comes from the same Spirit. Verse 9, to another, faith by the same Spirit. To another, the gifts of healing by the same Spirit. Now, right along with wisdom and knowledge comes faith and healing. All gifts. Some excel in that way. Some are outstanding examples of faith, and we all have to have faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. We went through about faith, hope, and love. You see, faith is what anchors our lives. Faith anchors and gives stability. Anchors our lives to the promises of God and to God's Word, to God Himself. Hope personalizes that faith and focuses that faith. It has to do with our anticipation, our focus in our mind on the fulfillment in our own personal lives of what God has promised. And love, of course, is the essence of the very character and nature of God. And it has to do with our relationship with God and our relationship with one another. You see, Paul goes through and explains that first you have to concentrate in the areas of faith and hope and love. You've got to focus in on the aspects of anchoring and stabilizing our life in relationship to God, focusing our anticipation in a way that enables us to go through all the ups and downs and crises of life, and to be filled with God's nature, the attitude of love. That they ultimately love is the greatest because it has to do with God's nature and with the motive for which we're to do everything else. But then we're told to follow after love. Go on from this and desire spiritual gifts. Now, the spiritual gifts are given that people might profit. See, 1 Corinthians 12:7. It's given to every man to profit or to benefit. Is it given to us to benefit ourselves? Oh, no. As we go on through, we find that it was given to benefit and serve others. Someone is given the gift of wisdom. It's not so that they can sort of sit back and chair and say, I'm the wisest guy since King Solomon. Oh, I've got the gift of wisdom. I just understand everything. Another one says, well, that's nothing. I know everything. We've all met a few know-it-alls, right? It's not given so that we can attract attention to ourselves and say, I know a whole lot more than you do. No, it's given to profit. It's given to benefit, to help and to advance others, whatever gift. Now, he talks about the gift of faith in an outstanding way. There are those who have, in an exceptional way, they have a remarkable gift of faith. And by that faith, they are able to influence and to impact others. Another, the gift of healings by the same Spirit. Verse 10, to another, the working of miracles. The word here, dunamis, it means powerful action or display. It's actually a word that's used. It includes miracles of all sorts. It is the same term that Christ told the apostles back in Acts 1:8. He said, you shall receive power after the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you'll be witnesses unto me both in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the earth. The word power here in Acts 1:8 is the same word, comes from the same word that is used here in 1 Corinthians 12, and is translated miracles there. It is translated power back in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8, and it's a term that was used many times in the Scriptures. I might show you another example or two. It's the word that's used in Matthew 23:54, that Jesus, when he was coming to his own country, taught them in their synagogue, insomuch that they were astonished, and they said, whence has this man this wisdom and these mighty works? The term mighty works here is the same word. It's translated power or miracles. It's the same term used down in verse 58 when it says, Christ did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief. So it is a word that refers to the mighty working of God's Spirit in us, which can certainly manifest itself and does manifest itself in miraculous intervention. Now, it goes on, verse 10 of 1 Corinthians 12, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy. Now, we think of prophecy simply as foretelling the future. The word prophecy, propheteia in the Greek, really, and the word that's used in the Old Testament that this is, used as a translation of, was a term that basically meant inspired speaking, speaking under direct inspiration of God. That included a foretelling of future events, but it was not limited to that. It simply, it included all speech that was directly inspired of God. God speaking through someone. Now, it doesn't mean God's like a ventriloquist and you're just standing there. But there are many examples of where God spoke through. He inspired. He placed certain thoughts and concepts and inspired that. And in some cases, a direct foreknowing of an event. It certainly includes that. The gift of prophecy, the gift of speaking under direct inspiration of God. To another, the discerning of spirits, having the ability to discern, to understand, and certainly this would primarily refer to the ability to recognize and discern evil spirits, being able, I think it could carry on through, and it certainly includes as well, because the term spirit was used in Greek like it is in English, that it can refer to attitude, it can refer to someone with special. To another, the discerning of spirits, having the ability to discern, to understand, and certainly this would primarily refer to the ability to recognize and discern evil spirits, being able, I think it could carry on through, and it certainly includes as well, because the term spirit was used in Greek like it is in English, that it can refer to attitude. It can refer to someone with special insight and being able to sort of see into someone. It refers to all of that. Then he mentions to another different kinds of tongues or languages. Yeah, that was a gift. God gave that. We see that. To another, the interpretation of tongues, the ability to interpret a language for those who otherwise did not understand. All of these work that one and the self-same Spirit, dividing to every man as he will. You see, God's Spirit works in us. By one Spirit, we're all baptized into one body, whether we be Jew or Gentile, bond or free. We've been all made to drink into one Spirit. The things that divide us on the human level, our gender, our ethnic background, our economic status, all the various things that divide people up into categories in the physical realm, are not spiritually divisive. We all, regardless of those things, male or female, rich or poor, regardless of our ethnic background, regardless of any of those things, we all drink into one Spirit. We are united in that way, partakers of the Spirit of God. Paul then goes through this example of the body and how there are different components of the body. We're told in verse 18, God has set the members, every one in the body, as it pleases Him. So we all have different functions to play, and every function is important. Now, he says, speaking here in verse 25, that there should be no schism in the body, but that the members should have the same care one for another. Whether one member suffers, all the members suffer with it, or one member be honored, all the members rejoice with it. You know, if we are really united by the Spirit of God, then we take it in a personal way, the things that happen to one another. If they're good, we're happy. If they're bad, we're sad about it. That we are connected to one another through the Spirit of God. Verse 27, he says, you're the body of Christ and members in particular. Verse 28, and God has set some in the church. First apostles, secondarily prophets, thirdly teachers. After that, miracles, then gifts of healings, helps, governments, diversities of tongues. Notice what some of the gifts are Paul mentions here. Now he starts out and he mentions initially certain offices, apostles. Well, we could go through the Bible and read what he says about apostles, and Paul claimed an apostleship. And secondarily, prophets. Thirdly, teachers. The ability to teach and to explain. After that, most people would have put miracles and tongues as first and second, wouldn't they, as gifts? Well, Paul put them down here. He said miracles, then gifts of healings, helps. You know, that's an interesting word. You look it up, and it means in Greek exactly what it means in English. It has to do literally with taking up. It means to help. It refers to loving action. It's a word that's used back in Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20, verse 35, Paul said, I have showed you all things, how that so laboring you ought to support the weak, and to remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how it's more blessed to give than to receive. The word here to support, in verse 35, to support the weak, the words to support, same word is translated help, back here in Acts 12. Well, it comes from the same word. It's a slightly different form of it, but that's what it means. To help or to support. That's listed here as one of the gifts. One of the ways that God's Spirit manifests itself. Some have a particular ability to help. To support the weak. To help, to encourage, to simply do something for somebody. That's a gift. It's listed right here with miracles and healings. Helps. Now you see, Paul is going through and he's explaining this because he's explaining it to people who wanted what was impressive and showy and looked good to other people. You know, you back there helping, I mean, that might mean you went over and cleaned the house for somebody that was sick. Well, that's not big and impressive and showy. I mean, you know, I guess you could get up and announce your name in church or something next Sabbath, but Christ talked in Matthew 5, 6 and 7, you know, he says when we serve and help and do things for others, then we need to do it privately because we're doing it before God and He sees and He knows and He'll reward us. But helps are mentioned right here. Governments. Again, this comes from a word in the Greek language that refers to a helmsman, somebody that steers a boat. That's actually what the term meant. In other words, it means those who steer, those who govern, those who, that's gift. Some have a particular ability to organize and to direct. And that's a gift. And that's listed right here with helping. There are a variety of ways to serve, and it may be through the ability to get out and to do things and to support and help. It may be an ability to sort of steer and guide, organize things, help make things work efficiently and smoothly. Diversities of tongues, of languages. Are all apostles, or all prophets, or all teachers, or all workers of miracles? Have all the gift of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? Covet earnestly the best gifts, and yet I show unto you a more excellent way. Then he begins to go through and explain about love. And then, in chapter 14, he says, now follow after love, and desire spiritual gifts, but rather that you may prophesy. In other words, that God can use you as an instrument through whom He can speak. This can be in a private context, and it can be in a public context. It has to do with being close enough to God that's the one Paul lists as what he thought was the greatest of these. Something where you could be used to help others. You see, he contrasts what the Corinthians were doing. He said, if you're speaking in a language that nobody understands, you're not speaking to people. If I got up here and started speaking in Swahili, I doubt any of you would understand it. Now, God would. That's fine. You know, God understands whatever language you speak. But if you're not speaking in a language that your audience understands, then you're not helping anyone. But if you, verse 3, prophesy, in other words, speak under inspiration of God, you're speaking unto men to edification and exhortation and comfort. In other words, if you are used as an instrument of God and you are inspired in your speaking, then that's going to help people. That's going to help your audience. If you speak in something, the Corinthians thought if they could somehow speak in some language, some mystic language or mystery language, that this was really great. That's what they were seeking after. They were distorted in their view based on earlier influences. And Paul said, you know, that's not going to help somebody unless the language you're speaking in is one that people understand, which is what was the case in Acts 2. If you're just speaking in a language, that's not helpful. But if you're inspired of God, then you can edify people, you can build up and instruct, you can exhort them and stir them to action, you can comfort them and encourage them. There are a lot of different things, different aspects that can be helpful. You know, you're not In one case, it's directed at yourself. In the other, it's directed at the church. You know, it wasn't that Paul had anything against if there was someone having the miraculous gift of languages that God would give. But he explains that in verse 9, unless you utter by the tongue words that are easy to be understood, how shall it be known what is spoken? You're just speaking into the air. You know, there are all kind of voices in the world, this is verse 10. And none of them without signification. You know, all languages have meaning. That's fine. But if I don't know the meaning of the voice, I'm a barbarian to him that speaks. And he's like a barbarian to me. We can't communicate. He says, verse 12, you're zealous of spiritual gifts. Seek that you may excel to the edifying of the church. You want spiritual gifts. He said, that's great. But what you need to be after is something that's going to help and encourage and build up others. See, that's the purpose of why God gives gifts. He doesn't give them so we can sort of strut around and say, boy, I can do something you can't do. The gifts God gives are given for the edification, the building up of the church. And brethren, for God to work through us, the more powerfully God will work through us, the more powerfully, as we, in that sense, get out of the way and let God's Spirit work and flow through us. You know, God's not going to give us something that is going to so puff us up and make us vain and cocky that we wouldn't be helping anybody. You see, the key to being used of God is to be truly humble and yielded to God. That's why spiritual gifts must follow after faith, hope, and love. Spiritual gifts don't precede faith, hope, and love. They follow after. You see, follow after love and desire spiritual gifts. Love has to do with our relationship with God, our relationship to one another. You know, someone who is filled with the love of God is a humble person because he's not self-focused and self-centered. For God to work through us powerfully, we must be truly yielded to God and focused on God, and not focused on ourselves, as the Corinthians, many of them were. Let's go back to Romans 12, because here's another place where we read of spiritual gifts. And Paul brings out some other things here, lists some of the same gifts. Romans 12:1, he says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. If we're going to present our bodies as a sacrifice, we have to be holy. A holy people unto our God. You know, Peter said in 1 Peter, he says, be you holy, as God is holy. Now, that's a quotation from Leviticus 19 and other places in Leviticus. That statement is repeated several times in Leviticus. Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. In other words, we're to become like God. We're to reflect God's ways in our life, in our values, in our conduct, and in our heart and mind. If we reflect it in our heart and mind, it will reflect in our conduct and in our actions. So he said, if we present our bodies, if we present ourselves as a living sacrifice, totally surrendered and yielded to God, we must be a holy people, acceptable unto God, presenting ourselves here this way. Don't be conformed to this world, verse 2, but be you transformed by the renewing of your mind. We can't just try to fit in and be part of this world and its society, just blending in where you can't tell the difference where the church stops and the world starts. Don't be conformed to this world, but be you transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's where it starts, is in the mind. And if the renewal takes place in the mind, it will reflect itself on the outside, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. We've already talked some about that. Then he says, I say unto you, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God has given to every man the measure of faith. We have many members in one body. Again, same analogy he drew back in 1 Corinthians 12. All members don't have the same office. Verse 6, having gifts differing according to the grace that is given unto us. You see, we have different strengths. We have different gifts. I think in many cases, the gifts of God's Holy Spirit in a number of cases, the gifts of the Spirit magnify maybe certain innate talents and abilities we have that are magnified through God's Holy Spirit. In other cases, in certain miraculous things, that is a little bit different. But primarily, I think God works through us. We have gifts differing one from another, according to what God has chosen to give us. So, he says, let us prophesy according to the proportion of faith. Or, as he says here, this is the New English, the gifts we possess differ, as they are allotted to us by God's grace and must be exercised accordingly. The gift of inspired utterance, for example, in proportion to a man's faith. Or the gift of administration. In administration, a teacher should employ his gift in teaching. One who has the gift of stirring speech should use it to stir his hearers. If you give to charity, give with all your heart. If you're a leader, exert yourself to lead. If you're helping others in distress, do it cheerfully. Love in all sincerity, loathing evil, and clinging to the good. Let love for our brotherhood breed warmth of mutual affection, give pride of place to one another in esteem. Now, that's the rendering of the New English Bible, which is a little bit different here than the King James, but it gives you sort of a different flavor of what he brings out. You see, verse 7, ministry, let us wait on our ministering. That means serving. There are a lot of ways to serve. You see, it's inspired speaking, getting up and speaking by inspiration of God. That's there. Serving, well, that's a gift. That's mentioned right here. We have gifts differing from one another. There are all kind of ways to serve. You know, that can involve everything from setting up and cleaning up the church hall to going over and helping somebody that's in need to just a thousand things that are important. That's a gift that's mentioned right here. It's mentioned right in with speaking under inspiration or teaching, having the ability to explain. Someone that exhorts, again, a little bit different. Some have a particular gift in that manner of speaking, of being able to stir people up. Others have an ability to give. Let them do it with simplicity. Oh, God's blessed some with resources and abilities, and that they're in a position to give and to help a lot of people. Now, he says do it with simplicity. There's a right way to carry out every gift. And none of those ways have to do with focusing the attention on ourselves. They have to do with using the opportunities and the gifts that God has given us. Someone gives, give with simplicity. Do it in a plain, simple way, not with a big show and trying to focus attention on yourself. He that rules with diligence. Maybe you have a gift for administering things, for organizing and setting things up and making it work smoothly, and that's important. You know, whether we're having a potluck meal or whether we're having an activity, somebody's got to organize things. You know, if everybody just set food every which way and everybody just sort of started in from all directions, that wouldn't work nearly as smoothly as doing it in that way. Well, God says if that's your gift, be diligent with it. In other words, put effort into it. He that shows mercy with cheerfulness. You know, if you have a particular gift of being able to be empathetic, to show compassion, that's a gift. And some people really excel at that. Do it with cheerfulness. You know, we are to, he says, let love be without dissimulation, without hypocrisy, without insincerity. We're not here to put on a show and to impress one another in that way. It's to come from the heart. Abhor that which is evil, cleave to that which is good. Be kindly affectioned one to another with brotherly love. In honor, preferring one another, seeking to help and to build up and to encourage. Not slothful in business, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. You know, this and characteristic that runs through our whole lives, whether it's in our secular life or in our prayer life or in anything, that we're to be fervent, not slothful, not careless, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing instant in prayer. Distributing to the necessity of saints, helping those in need. Given to hospitality, bless them that persecute you, bless and curse not. See, we are to help, to build, to give, to serve. Notice back in Luke 19. Luke chapter 19. Let's pick it up in verse 13. This is one of Christ's parables. The parable of the pounds. Luke 19:13, he called his 10 servants, and he delivered them 10 pounds, and he said unto them, Occupy till I come. Verse 15, it came to pass when he was returned, having received the kingdom, he commanded these servants to be called unto him, to whom he had given the money, that he might know how much every man had gained by trading. Then came the first and said, Lord, your pound has gained 10 pounds. He said, Well done, good servant. You've been faithful in very little. I'll give you authority over 10 cities. The second said, Lord, your pound has gained 5 pounds. He said, Likewise, be you also over 5 cities. Another came saying, Lord, here's your pound, which I've kept laid up in a napkin. I feared you. I was afraid that you were going to be hard. And so I just kept this here. And here it is. He said, verse 23, the Lord said, Why didn't you at least put the money in the bank and draw some interest on it? He said, Take from him that has the pound and give it to him that has 10 pounds. To every one that has shall be given, from him that has not, even that which he has shall be taken away. You know, we're all given certain things. Now, there's a similar parable back in Matthew 25, which we refer to as the parable of the talents. And it basically is the same thing, that man traveling into a far country called his servants, delivered his goods, gave one 5 talents, another 2, another 1. To every man according to his several ability. That's brought out in Matthew 25, verses 14 and 15. We are all given gifts. As it says here in Matthew 25, we're given according to our ability, according to what God feels that we have the innate capability of doing with. But we're all given gifts. And what is important, that we utilize those gifts for the glory of God and for the service of God's people. That we utilize the gifts that God gives us, realizing spiritual gifts are not the kinds of things that the world is looking for. It's not the result of some great hours-long emotional meeting where people begin to fall over backward. Someone begins to break forth in some sort of ecstatic gibberish. That's what the world is increasingly seeking after. A feeling. And they think that's spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts include a lot of things. It includes miraculous healings and miraculous displays. And it also includes simply the ability to, in a plain, simple way, go and help somebody, maybe take care of somebody that is sick or having a need. It has to do with everything from the way we go about our lives, the way we go about interacting with others. It has to do with a whole realm and gamut of serving. We all have gifts, talents, pounds. The parables point that way. It's important that we focus in on our relationship with God, which then carries out into our relationship with one another and ultimately into our attitude for the whole world. Because, brethren, ultimately our motive in proclaiming God's message to the world is to be the motive of love. A motive of a message of warning, a message of hope. Our whole purpose for doing that is to be motivated by love and concern for others. There were those who had love and concern who put their hearts into doing work that impacted every one of us here at some point. Maybe for some cases it was in recent years, and in other cases it may have been 15, 20, 30 years ago and more. That our lives were impacted. And the lives of others can be impacted. God is looking at for our motives, our relationship with Him, which is to carry through then into our relationship with one another and our attitude and our concern for the whole world, not just a self-focused concern. God gives talents and abilities. And God talks and inspires to be written in His Word about gifts of the Spirit. The way that God's Spirit can manifest itself through our lives. And it is to manifest itself and it will manifest itself as we walk with God and yield to Him and yield ourselves as instruments in His hands. Instruments, vessels that are fit and meet for the Master's use. For God to work in us and through us. We're told back in Daniel chapter 11 that those that know their God shall be strong and do exploits. The key to doing the exploits, the key to being used of God, is to know our God and to yield to Him and therefore to be used of Him. I would hope that all of us, as we go through and study about this matter of spiritual gifts, asking God to help us see ways that we can better allow His Spirit to flow through us, to help and to serve and to build up one another, and to realize that God has called us to be part of something that has a purpose in today's world and that carries right on through in the world that is to come. Brethren, we have a great and a glorious calling, and we have the help of the power of God's Spirit to enable us to fulfill our calling to its ultimate. Let's draw near to God and yield ourselves so that God's Spirit can work in us powerfully more and more as the days and weeks and months go by.